Thank you, Aaron, and thanks everybody for coming on such a disgusting night. It's amazing that you all made it to hear something about 19th century banking. So we're delighted to see you all here. I am going to introduce Ray in just a moment, but I thought I'd take the opportunity very briefly to talk about the Library of Mistakes, what it is, where it is, and what it does. It is here in Edinburgh. It's a room full of books. There are younger members of the audience who don't maybe know what that is, but it's a library because one of the most often asked questions is, does it exist? But this one actually is in the real world, and it's your library because it's a public library. If you're interested in going there, it is fundamentally about business and financial history, but that is largely a issue of mistakes, but also many successes. You can go and read there. It's open 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. And to do that, you simply go to our website, register as a reader, and then arrange a visit and go whenever you want. Where is it? It's just behind Charlotte Square, Weems Place, more precisely Weems Place Mews, which is through the great big arch as you walk down Weems Place. So you're all welcome to join and all welcome to come along. Apart from physically going to the library and reading books, we do these lectures very regularly. I'm delighted that we're partnering with the EICC for this particular lecture. This is our first venture together, but I hope there are many more to come. But there's at least 8 or 9 of these lectures a year hosted by our partners and sometimes actually hosted in the Library of Mistakes. I do warn you, however, if you're coming to the Library of Mistakes, these are the most, where you're sitting tonight, would be the most comfortable seats you've ever had. The Library of Mistakes is slightly more Presbyterian in its seating. You can tell the regulars laughing at that, but we do host these lectures and you're very welcome. You'll also find those lectures on the website. We do short videos of each of them and they are there if you go to the tab that says lectures. And we have this Twitter account, which I think is up there, and you can follow us on Twitter. There's over 900 people following us on Twitter. The message and the reason for the library existing is to say that there's much in financial history that can inform the financial present and the financial future, and forgetting those lessons is dangerous indeed. And I think probably most of us in this audience know that and have discovered that reasonably recently. I'm going to introduce Ray, but you probably know that apart from writing this book, Ray also wrote Hubris, which was the rise and fall of HBOS. There are obviously parallels between the City of Glasgow Bank and HBOS, and we'll be discussing that as we go forward. Ray has been a financial journalist for longer than I'm allowed to say, has covered many of the ups and downs of the financial world, but has also seen it slightly from the inside because he was the Chief Executive Officer of Scottish Financial Enterprise. But we are here tonight to discuss the City of Glasgow Bank, but it is in the context of this book, which Ray has just written and is just published, which is the first ever financial history of Edinburgh. So the well-named Rise and Fall of the City of Money, a financial history of Edinburgh. It would be impossible to cover this in 1 hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours. So we're doing excerpts. Tonight, Ray is going to talk about the City of Glasgow Bank, why it failed, how it failed, what happened to its directors, and hopefully we will engage you all afterwards in a discussion as to what that means for the current and future of finance. Ray, the City of Glasgow Bank. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Russell, and thank you all for coming on such an awful night. I suspect that the clever marketing by the EICC in putting the word banker and prison in the same sentence attracted many people here this evening. My book is a financial history. It's a history of finance in Edinburgh from the late 17th century with the formation of the Bank of Scotland and the Company of Scotland that promoted the ill-fated Darien scheme up to, as Russell said, the credit crunch of 2008 and, of course, the collapse of HBOS and Royal Bank of Scotland. It's a history. But when I went onto Google today to look for my book, as you do as an author every day, I noticed that Google gives all the details of the book and the genre underneath, and it says true crime. And I just want to stress that not all financial services is crime. But tonight I am going to speak about a crime. And although it's a history of Edinburgh, I'm going to speak about the collapse of the City of Glasgow Bank. And there are a lot of Edinburgh connection with that. And of course, it had implications right across Scotland and, in case, across the UK too. So the story starts in Edinburgh on the 30th of September, 1878. And that is the day on which the general managers of the Scottish banks, and in those days there were 5 banks in Edinburgh, the 2 oldest, Bank of Scotland and Royal Bank, of course, but then British Linen Bank, which had been founded over 100 years before, and then 2 more recent banks, the Commercial Bank of Scotland, the National Bank of Scotland, and from Glasgow, 3 major banks, Clydesdale, the Union Bank of Scotland, and of course the City of Glasgow Bank. And normally the general managers just met to carve up the market between them. They ran a cartel. So they fixed interest rates, they fixed charges, they didn't really compete. They just divided the market between them. It's a pretty boring meeting, except on this occasion, 30th of September, 1878, there was an extra item on the agenda, and that item was an emergency loan for the City of Glasgow Bank of £300,000. Now, in those days, £300,000 was a very substantial sum of money, and the other general managers were rather puzzled as to why City of Glasgow needed this money. And they were puzzled because it was one of the biggest banks in Scotland. In fact, it was one of the biggest banks in Britain at the time. It had 133 branches, more branches than any other Scottish bank. And 4 months before, it had published record profits. Some shades of 2008 there. And its record profits had shown capital of £1 million and reserves of £450,000, a profit of £140,000, and a dividend for its shareholders of 12%. So these days we would kill for a dividend of 12%. And so the general managers asked the general manager of the City of Glasgow Bank, a man called Robert Stronach, why do you need the money? And he said, well, maybe we have underestimated the losses on our acceptance of commercial bills. That's a way of lending to commercial companies. Well, the other banks weren't going to sort of give them the money without questions. So they sent an accountant through to Glasgow, a man with the wonderful name of George Old Joe Jameson, CA. He later became quite famous. But he went through to Glasgow. On the day afterwards, the 1st of October, he did a preliminary look through the accounts of the City of Glasgow, and he came back to Edinburgh, reported to the other banks, and said the deficit on the balance sheet could be as much as £3 million. Now remember, the capital is only £1 million. So the other banks refused a loan. It transpired that the City of Glasgow Bank had already been to London to ask the Bank of England for an emergency loan and got the same answer. No one was prepared to lend to them. So on the evening of the 1st of October, they closed the bank and they decided to send in an investigating team, a lawyer, an accountant, to come up with a state of affairs which they could put to the shareholders with a recommendation that they go for liquidation. The following morning, the 2nd of October, the news had got around that the bank was closed. There was a clamour outside the head office. Head office was in Virginia Street, Glasgow. Those of you know Glasgow tour, Virginia Street comes down to Argyle Street, and the front door of the City of Glasgow Bank is now the side entrance to Marks and Spencer's. But there was a clamour of people around there trying to get their money out, and in every branch there were people, depositors, trying to get their money out, but they couldn't because the bank was closed. The lawyer and the accountant produced their report in just over 2 weeks. Clearly, they're not being paid by the hour in the 19th century. And it was to go to a meeting of shareholders, but it got leaked, and it was published in the newspapers on the 19th of October, and it showed that the position was even worse than had first been assumed. It estimated the deficit at £5.5 million. To put that in context, it was at the time 5% of Scottish GDP and 0.5% of UK GDP. It was an enormous loss. Not only that, but they reckoned that accounts had been falsified for years past. Lending had been understated. The security on that, against which that lending was made, had been overstated. And the bank had been making false returns to the Treasury every month to support its note issues. So banks that issued banknotes, and all the Scottish banks did, had to keep a reserve of a certain amount of gold and silver to support the amount of banknotes in circulation. And City of Glasgow Bank had been increasing its note issue month after month, year after year, and supporting that by putting in completely false returns to the government. It was a hopeless situation. Total debts, bad debts, were estimated at 7.3 million, and 2/3 of it was owed by 4 companies. And these 4 companies all turned out to have quite a close relationship with the bank. There was a man called James Morton, who had started life as a stationer, and he got involved with the bank because he supplied their checkbooks. But as he got involved and he became known to the directors, and particularly to one director, he started to borrow money to speculate in the land market in newly emerging markets at the time, New Zealand and Australia. And he bought 40,000 acres in the very aptly named Poverty Bay in New Zealand. He bought 10,000 acres in Queensland and a similar sort of size of farm in New South Wales, and then the bottom dropped out of both the land market in Australia and New Zealand and also the sheep market. So he couldn't sell these properties and he couldn't repay his borrowing. He'd borrowed 2.2 million. There were the Fleming brothers. There was James Fleming, who had been himself a former director of the bank, and he had borrowed money, 1.3 million, to invest in American railway shares. And he owned shares in the Racine and Mississippi Railroad, which unfortunately the price had collapsed and he couldn't sell them. There was his brother, John Fleming, known as Bombay Jock, because he had bought land speculatively around the harbour and port in Bombay, thinking there would be a great boom. There might have been a great boom, but not at the time when he was trying to unload this land to pay off his debts. And the 4th man was actually a serving director of the City of Glasgow Bank, a man called John Innes-Wright, who was a merchant and had borrowed from them. As soon as this became public, and there are echoes of 2008, and perhaps Russell will bring them out later, but as soon as this became public, something very different happened in 1878 to happened in 2008. The Lord Advocate, the most senior law officer in Scotland, ordered in the police. And the police arrested not only the general manager, but the entire board, executive and non-executive. And they were taken before the sheriff, and they were charged with false accounting and fraud. They asked for bail, and it was refused. And they were taken to Duke Street Prison in Glasgow. The pictures that were going up, there was a huge sort of barracks of a place. That was Duke Street. It was the biggest prison in Glasgow, the biggest prison in Scotland, and it was notorious for the bad conditions inside it. There was actually, the conditions were so bad that a song was made up about them. And none of you signed up to hear me sing this evening. The doors are not locked. Anybody who wants to leave at this point may do so. And there's one disclaimer. I've been in Scotland for more than half my life now, but I still haven't mastered the Glasgow accent. So apologies to any Glaswegians that are present. And with a great Glasgow irony, it's set to the tune of Happy Land. And it goes, there is a happy land down Duke Street Jail, where all the prisoners stand tied to a nail. Ham and eggs they never see, dirty water for their tea. There they live in misery. God save the Queen. Russell Napier will pass among you with a hat. I like the little flourish, God Save the Queen, at the end that shows the true Glasgow spirit. However, the conditions may have been terrible, but the directors of the City of Glasgow Bank were on remand. They hadn't actually been convicted, and so they were allowed to maintain themselves at their own expense, which I think meant that they could wear their own clothes, they could have food brought in, and they probably had blankets. But nevertheless, mixing among the murderers, thieves, cutthroats, and vagabonds who made up the rest of the population in Duke Street cannot be much fun. They were not young men. Henry Inglis, a lawyer from Edinburgh, who lived at number 1 Great Stewart Street, was 72. John Innes Wright, the man I mentioned before, who was the rector of the bank and also one of its biggest borrowers, was 68. Robert Salmond, another director, was 74. William Tabor was 66. John Stewart, another Edinburgh person, a wine merchant, was 61. Robert Stronach, the general manager, was 52. He was the youngest. And Lewis Potter, who was the sort of lead director, the chairman at the time, described as a snarling and garrulous old bully, was 71. He was also a wee free, and he, while waiting for the police, sang hymns. In November, they were brought before the sheriff again, and extra charges were laid against them, the charges of embezzlement, theft, because all but one of the directors also had an overdraft from the bank. And when you added that money together, it was £20,000 that they had borrowed from the bank and was now not going to be repaid. The one director who had not got an overdraft was allowed bail, £15,000 surety, an enormous sum of money. But the rest were sent back to prison, and they spent Christmas and New Year in Duke Street. In the middle of January 1879, they were brought to Edinburgh because it was believed they could not get a fair trial in Glasgow. There were so many depositors and so many shareholders who had lost out that they would not get a fair hearing. So they were brought to Edinburgh, to the Carlton jail, and there they were transferred to the High Court for the trial, which lasted 2 weeks in January. In order to prove fraud, the prosecution had to produce a list of victims, and I was going to say almost at random, but clearly it's not random. They chose half a dozen shareholders who were the victims of the fraud. Most of the shareholders lived in Glasgow, but I'm just looking down this list now. I think there are about a dozen of them. All but 2 are from Edinburgh. They were clearly playing to the Edinburgh jury that was going to try these people. And they included individuals, they included a Kirk minister, they included Hamilton and Inches, the jeweller down in George Street. And since Russell lives in Newbattle, I told him that I would mention they included Robert Craig of Craig-esque House, Newbattle. So these people were the victims. Charges were dropped against one director who then gave evidence for the prosecution. During the trial, which went on for 2 weeks, the theft charges were dropped because the judge accepted that they had not acted out of personal gain, but they were all convicted. And Stronach, the general manager, effectively the chief executive, and Lewis Potter, the chairman, got 18 months each in prison. The other directors all got 8 months each. Stronach and Potter were convicted of knowingly publishing false balance sheets, the others of allowing false balance sheets to be published without really knowing what they were. The sentences were very light. I mean, the average forger got much more than that. And The Economist wrote a leader saying that they were totally inadequate. They leave a lot of dissatisfaction behind with questions asked as to why the defendants did not receive the harshest penalty available under law. How had the deception gone on for so long, undetected? And the reason was that the directors didn't ask questions. They really didn't understand what was happening in the bank. Those that did ask embarrassing questions were quickly eased out, and their places taken by men of straw who were more compliant. Now came the real tragedy of the whole thing, because the bank had unlimited liability, and this was quite common in the 19th century. Very few companies had limited liability. An unlimited liability meant that their shareholders were liable for the entire deficit on the collapse of the bank, and their shareholders were mostly artisans, small professionals, teachers, lawyers, doctors, widows and orphans. There were 1,800 shareholders, and they had to not only lose the money they'd invested, but also make good the deficit. So for the first call, the liquidators asked the shareholders for £500 for each £100 share that they owned. They were having to put in 5 times the money they'd already lost. That was enough to bankrupt most of them. And so the burden fell on the remaining solvent shareholders. And the second call was for £2,250 per £100 share. Now, not surprisingly, of the 1,800 shareholders, at the end of the liquidation, when all the depositors got their money back, by the way, at the end of the liquidation, only 129 shareholders remained solvent. There was a particularly poignant problem with the trustees of widows, orphans, and charities, because the trustees under law actually were the shareholders. And it was insisted that the trustees personally were liable for the shares they held on behalf of their beneficiaries. There were 480 trustees, mostly lawyers, and of these, only 125 remained solvent after the liquidation. The economic effect on Glasgow was enormous. A great depression appeared on the city, so bad that, in fact, a relief fund had to be launched by public subscription, and that raised eventually £380,000. And the Edinburgh banks themselves contributed that. Royal Bank put in £20,000 for the relief of those people made destitute by the collapse of the City of Glasgow Bank. What were the consequences of that? Well, there are lasting consequences even now. One of them was that limited liability for banks was officially declared a bad thing. It was a bad thing because of the economic damage that could be done, but many banks had clung to that because they believed that the perception of a bank where the shareholders had responsibility for the debts of the bank made them appear safer, but clearly that wasn't the case. And so the government introduced, first of all, a hybrid form of liability where shareholders still had some liability, but it was capped, and then eventually all banks got limited liability. The government, for the first time, took a much closer interest in the accounts of banks because clearly it had not scrutinized the returns from the City of Glasgow Bank at all, and it had been misled for years about the true position of the bank. And for the first time, banks were required to publish audited balance sheets and accounts. Up until this point, some banks had done so voluntarily, but some had not. Some had not bothered to publish their accounts. Among those were Royal Bank of Scotland and Bank of Scotland, incidentally, who published their accounts for the first time in 1879. So that is the story of the collapse of the City of Glasgow Bank. At the beginning of my book, there is a saying, a very wise saying, which was given to me by Russell. He heard it from an American commentator called James Grant, which is, in science and technology, knowledge is cumulative, but in finance, it is cyclical. And I think some of the lessons of the City of Glasgow Bank collapse have not been learned even as late as 2008. Thank you.
So we will try and talk about, with parallels of the modern day. The judge decided that, motive is very important to criminal law, and the judge decided that they had not done it with the motivation of personal gain. Upon what motivation did they do it? If it wasn't personal gain, was it pure stupidity? And I also assume they were shareholders. So on what basis was this done, if not on personal gain? And then how do we draw that line, that important line between a level of negligence which is so grave that it gets you to a criminal conviction, as opposed to perhaps if we couldn't even prove personal gain?
As I said, a large part of the deficit, 2/3 of the lending, the debt, had gone into 4 companies. And what happened was that they lent to these companies partly because of the personal links between the individuals who ran these companies and the bank. And as these companies, the debt that the companies owed to the bank got bigger and bigger, and it became clearer and clearer that they could not pay it off, the bank had an incentive to keep the whole thing going. I suppose the gambler's illusion is that, sooner or later you'll be able to trade out of it, but it doesn't work. And in this case, in a way, the debtors of the bank, the people who had borrowed from it, became the masters of the bank, because had they declared themselves bankrupt, not paid off the debt, then the bank would have been insolvent. And so I think the directors went along with this fantasy in order to keep the bank from collapse. And they probably believed that by doing that, they were doing the right thing.
And the criminal line they crossed was false accounting.
The criminal line they crossed was false accounting, but also they were convicted of fraud. So false accounting led to fraud because, of course, the shareholders had been defrauded.
In that light, can you say anything about our recent financial collapse?
Well, there are some parallels there. If you read the Financial Services Authority report into the collapse of HBOS, you'll see this same criticism that a disproportionate amount of lending had been done to a very small number of borrowers. It wasn't as small as 4 in the case of HBOS, but it was a relatively small number of companies in the property industry, led by individuals who had close ties with the banks. And those individuals borrowed more and more, and the amount lent to individuals and to companies got bigger and bigger, to the stage where the bank couldn't withdraw from that, because if it had done, it would have collapsed the whole bank. So there are parallels with that.
In the modern case, the personal gain is much easier to show based upon the size of bonuses that were paid for making those loans, and yet none of that was able to find its way into court.
I've had this discussion many times. No bonuses were clawed back. There was one individual, Peter Cummings, who was the corporate director of HBOS. He was one of 2 individuals who were sanctioned by the regulator. Nobody went to jail over the collapse of Royal Bank and HBOS. But 2 individuals, one in each bank, were sanctioned by the regulator. And Cummings voluntarily gave up part of his bonus. Fred Goodwin, as we know, was bludgeoned into giving up part of his pension. But no bonuses were clawed back, and there were no sanctions, legal or otherwise, on any of the non-executive directors, or the finance directors, or the auditors of these banks.
So one of the ideas from financial history, which is being sort of reinvigorated to help regulate banks, is the unlimited liability, or greater liability for those who own shares, or even for different type of liability for those who own bonds. But incredibly, in this case, it just didn't make any difference. Do you have a view on whether we could increase the scale of liability for shareholders, not perhaps to infinity, not unlimited, but a factor of the share price? Do you think that is a route to which we can make banking safe, changing the nature of the capital structure, maybe not as radically as we had for the City of Glasgow Bank?
Well, the problem now is that banks are so big and proportionately shareholders are much smaller, own a much smaller proportion of the bank. I don't know, institutional investors, if they found they had a liability beyond their investment, would they exercise more control and more scrutiny over the banks? You've been an institutional investor and I haven't, so you could answer that question probably better than I could.
I think there are institutional investors who would hold these instruments as long as it wasn't unlimited liability. They would expect a higher return for that, presumably a higher dividend for that, but it may be one way to try. I mean, changing the capital structure isn't the only way to do this, but I think there are things we could do in the capital structure to make shareholders more vigilant. Clearly, there was no vigilance by shareholders in this case because they left it entirely up to the directors.
Yes, and it's very difficult to know what shareholders in 1878 or even in 2008 could have done to look beyond the published figures, because if the directors were ignorant of what was going on in the bank, then surely the shareholders would have been equally ignorant.
And there was another common theme, which is a lot of this money was lost far from Scotland's shores, which was also true in 2008, given that RBS was the world's biggest bank, very briefly. Is there something running through Scotland's history where it insists on a global remit, whether it's Darien or City of Glasgow Bank or RBS, and it falls foul of economic imperialism, if you want to?
Yeah, you're right. You're right to the extent that the City of Glasgow Bank and a previous collapse 20 years before that, another Glasgow bank, the Western Bank of Glasgow, had both invested in things they didn't understand. So the Australian and New Zealand sheep market and farm market was one of them, but also American railway mortgages was another. But there was money to be made if you did the work, understood the market, and had the right capital structure to exploit that market. And what happened after the collapse is that the other Scottish banks said, that's it, we're not investing outside Scotland. These are things about which we know nothing and we'll just keep out. And that left space for new entrepreneurs who came in very quickly after that, particularly Robert Fleming in Dundee and a man called William Menzies in Edinburgh, who invented between them the modern investment trust. It already existed in London, but they adapted it. They found structures which could mitigate the risk. They were prepared to do the work. Fleming, I think, went to America something like 125 times during his life. William Menzies, when he retired, estimated he'd spent a whole year of his life on the Atlantic Ocean. They actually went and kicked the tires, or in this case, the railway wheels, and made a success of investing that in the way that the banks had made a failure of it.
So we're very keen to have your questions from the audience, and there are two microphones which we're going to move around for that. So I can sit and ask Ray questions all night, but if you have any questions, please. We'll start with this gentleman.
Hello. Was there a particular culture in the bank, the Glasgow Bank, that set it apart from the other banks and made it more susceptible to a failure?
Yes, I should have mentioned the culture, because that's another parallel with Royal Bank of Scotland. This man, Lewis Potter, described as a bully, really ran the bank. In fact, when the accountant went over to do the preliminary survey, he met with Potter and he met with effectively the chief executive, Stronach, but it was Potter who did all the talking. And Potter bullied his other directors and the staff of the bank, so that there was a culture of fear in the bank. And I'm sure you've read the stories of the bullying culture in Royal Bank of Scotland under Fred Goodwin. So there were similar, and culture has a big part to play in the failure of a bank like this.
There is an east-west issue in this between Glasgow and Edinburgh, I think many people over the years have alleged that the two big banks, both Edinburgh-based, colluded to, if you like, exclude the Glaswegian banks and force them into slightly more speculative lending, or is any justification in that?
That may have been true with the collapse of the Western Bank 20 years earlier, where there was, the Edinburgh banks did actually contribute to the failure of the Western Bank by a number of the things they did, but I think they'd learned their lesson by the failure of the City of Glasgow Bank, and the Edinburgh banks did what they could to help out the depositors at that time.
So do we have any more questions from the floor? Right in the front of the middle here is what I can see. If you.
I was just wondering, given the size of the deficit of the City of Glasgow Bank, had they been given the loan that they asked for, would it have made any difference at all?
No. I mean, I think that's one of the things that decided them just to cut off. And they recognised what would happen. The City of Glasgow Bank would go down, and that would destabilise the whole of the banking system in Scotland. So it was a big decision for them. But when the accountant came back and said, no, the deficit could be at least 3 million, they realised that 300,000 was going to go nowhere. And they were going to be required to put in more money, and the chances of them getting it back were practically zero.
So if it had been now, do you think people would have regarded the City of Glasgow Bank as too big to fail?
Clearly they didn't, and the government had a different attitude in those days. The government didn't really take any responsibility for the banking system at all. But there is a parallel to this, because if you remember back 2008, HBOS got into deep trouble, and Lloyds Bank decided that it would take over HBOS. It would have a commanding share of the banking market in Britain, and it would only cost it £10 billion, because that was the estimate of the balance sheet deficit on HBOS. It reckoned it was cheap at the price. Well, Lloyds lost £56 billion in HBOS. So clearly, and itself had to be rescued by the government. So clearly, you know, the same thing happened again, and if they'd been a bit wiser like the Edinburgh banks were in 1878, they may not have rescued HBOS.
So the rationale for the government saving the banks was to protect depositors.
Yes.
But in this case, depositors were perfectly okay, despite the failure of the bank.
Well, they were perfectly okay, except that it took them a long time to get their money out. The other banks did make arrangements where they would allow the depositors to transfer their deposits and access half the money, but they wouldn't allow them the whole amount of money until the liquidation is complete. And the liquidation took a number of years, and the liquidators had to take legal action against a number of recalcitrant large shareholders who didn't pay up their liability straight away.
So in the Great Depression, when banks closed, some people in this room are old enough to remember the bank passbook, which had all of your bank passbooks when the banks were closed, traded in the market at a discount. So you could sell your deposits to somebody else who would speculate that that bank was about to reopen. I'm sure we have some more questions. Hamish in the.
The whole collapse took very little time. How did the head office manage to tell all 130 branches to close down on that, the following day? I mean, I suppose we would have had did we have telegrams in those days?
They had just telegraph.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
that was a way.
They didn't have telephones, but they had telegraph.
And that was the way they just said, close the doors and lock the doors.
Lock the doors.
Yep.
I'd like to speculate that in 1878, the accountancy profession was somewhat underdeveloped, and that those accounts which some banks published were probably not very accurate, irrespective of whether they were City of Glasgow Bank or any other bank, because we know there was a lot of window dressing went on before these accounts came out. And my attendant speculation is that in 2008, the accountancy profession was somewhat overdeveloped. and that hardly anybody understood the accounts that were being produced.
So just on that, I was speaking to a banks analyst the other day, and he tells me that the last HSBC set of accounts is 552 pages long. Sorry, can we there's a gentleman right at the front. Just Michael, can you put your hand up a bit higher?
Russell, you mentioned that the government really didn't take any hand at all in regulation of the banks. Now, regulation obviously was there in 2008, but to what extent was tripartite regulation and a light touch a contributory factor all those years later?
I think I should let Ray answer that question.
It was a big factor. And there is evidence of bullying of the regulator by the banks. Particularly the chairman of HBOS wrote a rather aggressive letter to the regulator. And also the regulator was understaffed. Compared to the banks, their resources were very meager. And the banks were able to run rings around them. And also the regulator had a whole array of financial services companies, not only banks, to regulate. They just weren't up to the job. I'm not sure now, although we have more stringent regulations for the amount of capital that has to be maintained against losses, for example, and we have a number of other regulations about conduct which have come in. I'm not sure that we have a regulator equal to the task of regulating the banks, and I suspect that it'll only be a matter of time before we get another major failure, although I hope not on the scale of 2008.
I think it could also be said that the regulator was something of a revolving door as regards personnel, and the banks were very prone to actually take on board people from the regulator.
And pay them more.
Exactly.
So just before this gentleman asks us a question, the world's smartest lawyer is called Charlie Munger. I'm sure many of you know who he is. He's the brains behind Warren Buffett. Charlie Munger's favourite saying is, show me incentives and I'll show you outcomes. So yes, it's about regulation, but it's the incentives of the people who run the banks. And they had huge upside, and as it turns out, incredibly little downside. And if you put any human being with that set of incentives, you're going to get bad behaviour. So I think it's not just about regulation, it's making sure the incentives are there. Reasonable rewards over the long term and punishment for something that goes beyond mere negligence. So I've got another question. You've written the book, you've done hubris. If you'd pick one or two recommendations to our government on how they should change financial regulation based on all of this knowledge and study, do you have a couple you'd pick out in particular?
My favourite would be break up the big banks.
Okay.
In my living memory, we had a much more diverse ecosystem of banks. We had big national banks and international banks, but we still had regional banks. Not only in Scotland, we kept our regional banks in Scotland much longer than other parts of Britain, but in Yorkshire, for example, and in Manchester. And we also had local banks. And now we just have 4 big national banks and a few underfunded challenger banks, they're called, but they're not actually putting up much of a challenge, which are struggling to compete in that market. And so too big to fail, in my view, is too big to manage, and those banks should have been broken up.
Anything else?
More questions, so I'll think about that while I answer the next one.
Sorry, this lady in the front, in the second row.
Hi, so you and others are predicting another kind of crash, whether or not you're saying what size it might be. I was really interested by Iceland's reaction to the previous financial crisis, where they all went out in protest and prevented the bailout of the big banks. So do you think that is a possibility in Britain? And if it was a possibility, would that be something that you would see as a good idea or constructive?
Do I think that another crash is coming?
No. If another crash does come, should the banks take more of the pain than they did last time? Should the shareholders take more of the pain? Should the creditors to the banks take more of the pain, rather than that going straight to the government?
Well, it is very difficult for a government to stand back and allow the bank to fail, and therefore the depositors to lose their money, if that bank is so important in the economy that the wider economic damage would depress the entire economy. And so the answer to that is, if you have smaller banks, some of them can fail. And the shareholders would then be, it's back to your point about shareholder liability, the shareholders would be more aware that their money is at risk. And the directors of the bank would not have that fail-safe that my bank is so big it cannot be allowed to fail, therefore there is no sanction on the risks I take. And so I think it does go back to the size of banks. We've allowed banks to become far too big.
Since that events in Iceland, there's been a major change in legislation in Europe. It's called the Bank Resolution and Recovery Directive, and it sees a very different way forward now for what might happen, which is that the equity shareholders would be wiped out, but then the bondholders would be wiped out. And that is patently something that didn't happen the last time around. Remember, many of these banks hadn't just borrowed from depositors, they had borrowed from financial institutions, and one of the reasons for the bailout was to save the bacon of those financial institutions. Well, the Bank Resolution and Recovery Directive, in theory, would stop that happening, and those people who had lent through bonds to the banks would be bailed in, and their money would disappear, and the government's balance sheet wouldn't be used. But on top of that, so would large-scale depositors. So the current law is that if you have a deposit of up to 100,000 euros in the bank, then that will be made good by the government or anybody else. But now, technically, sums above that, for anybody who's lucky to have a deposit above that, and most corporations in Europe would have deposits above that, will see the value of their deposit shrink if that bank has to be bailed in. So that the whole point of this is to move the burden off the government back onto shareholders, back onto bondholders. And I keep saying saying it, putting it in legislation, and doing it are two entirely different things. But we have two examples in Europe, one in Italy and one in Portugal, where we did approach this a different way. And I'm in contact with the man who put the Icelandic bankers in jail. I know him, and we hope to have him at the Library of Mistakes very soon, discussing how you put bankers in jail. I'll just have a broad, just on the front row.
So we've spoken about how to hold shareholders more accountable for the failure of banks. But then I guess the other thing is, how do you make the board of directors more accountable to the shareholders? And then one way of doing that was coming up with financial accounts and getting them audited, and then they're given to the shareholders and they go, yeah, that's fine, thanks very much. So do you think that loop is broken or needs to be fixed, or is there something wrong with the way auditors do audits now? Are they outdated? Is there other ways the shareholders can actually hold the people who are running a bank, running a company, more to account? Like, what is it that shareholders can do more? Because like back in 1878, it was normal people that were the shareholders, and like a school teacher maybe doesn't know how to go around that. And then same with today, where it's like people's pensions are actually, they're holding stocks and shares. So how do you get shareholders to hold the board of directors, people managing companies, to be accountable? And then I guess the other bit of that is, how do you make audit better?
Well, the guardians of the shareholder interest are supposed to be the directors of the company. They are supposed to work for the shareholders and not for the management or for the company other than the shareholders. And in the case of the recent bank failures, 2008, in the case of the City of Glasgow Bank in 1878, they clearly didn't do that. And there were no sanctions on them. There were no sanctions from the shareholders, and there were no sanctions from the government or from the regulators. Now, I remember when I first came to Scotland as a reporter, when I was reporting for the Financial Times here, in I think 1976 or 77, I reported a case in the Sheriff Court in Glasgow of a company called Scottish and Universal Investments. And it had classified in its accounts a sum of 4.2 million as cash in hand or at bank. It wasn't in hand It wasn't in the bank, it was actually down the Swanee. They had lent it to a property company and it had gone bust and they had lost the money. The Department of Trade and Industry, the forerunner of the current Department of Business, prosecuted every director, both the executive directors and the non-executive directors, and they all had to appear in Glasgow Sheriff Court. Now, they were fined very small sums of money, in hundreds rather than thousands of pounds, but nevertheless, you know, they were held up to public scrutiny. They were made to account for what they'd done, and some of them were banned from being directors of public companies for a number of years. And it used to be routine that people who presided over companies which had gone bust, where there was something other than just normal commercial practice involved, would be banned as directors for 2 years, for 5 years, whatever it might be. No sanction was applied to any of the directors of Royal Bank or HBOS, and 2 of them, the chairman of HBOS and the finance director of HBOS, actually went on to be approved persons to run financial services companies after that. So I think we need to make directors much more aware of their responsibility both to the shareholders and to the wider public.
And there was also a question in there about audit. So one of the recommendations potentially coming through an audit is that they would have to be standalone organisations stripped out of, let's just say, the big 4, but accountancy companies in general. Do you think that's a step in the right direction?
I do think it's, I think the point that was made earlier, that audit companies also get huge amounts of consultancy work, clearly influences auditors, and those two ought to be rigidly separated, as they are in some other countries. But also the directors need to question the auditors much more thoroughly than they do. They accept the audited accounts, and often the auditors are beholden to the management to produce the figures. So it does come down to governance in the end, and culture, as I was saying before, that there has to be a culture, there has to be a realization by directors that they safeguard the interests of the shareholders and the other stakeholders, rather than the management of the company.
So I think there's time for 2 more questions. So we'll just take this gentleman here and then the gentleman in the middle. We can do that.
Russell, you talked about how do we put bankers in jail? And the key thing, one of the things which emerged from Ray's talk earlier was that the Glasgow bankers were given pretty pathetic sentences for their activities. So why was that, and did it set a precedent which is now being repeated? In other words, do bankers frankly think they can simply get away with it?
They do get away with it. It didn't set a precedent because no banker, no director of a bank has gone to jail since. The people who jailed are the little people, and they get quite heavy sentences actually. So they got away with it, I think, because they were the same social class as the judge.
No bank has failed in that intervening period. I think they would have all failed in 1914, but that wasn't due to negligence, that was for other reasons. But we then had a very long period of, shall we call it, banking stability?
Well, very conservative banking anyway.
But why did we then have that period from the failure of the City of Glasgow to 2008 where we had banking stability?
We had, well, we're going to get into a completely new discussion
maybe
now.
1974, pointing out west, but for a long period of time.
If you can all come back tomorrow, we'll continue this. 1986, Mrs. Thatcher deregulated the financial services market, and that led to a chain of events which made banks particularly less safe and encouraged them to take risks.
So the last question was just in the middle here. We are hoping to have, there's a book on Big Bang, and we're hoping to have the author of Likely Mistakes soon to discuss deregulation.
Going back to the idea, Ray, of breaking up the big banks, presumably to make all banks about the same sort of size, how would you then incentivize the directors and the managers of those banks to stop them getting big again?
Not to make them big again.
Well, there's no point breaking them up and making them medium-sized if they then just take another 5 years and become as big as they were.
Well, you could tax their bonuses more heavily than they are. There used to be a period when bankers didn't get bonuses, and to be a manager of a bank or a manager of a branch of a bank was a well-paid job with good status in the community, and you earned the respect of both of your customers and the wider community, but you didn't expect to make huge bonuses. Now, the bonuses paid to the chief executive of the bank are just huge. I'll give you an actual example of that. When Bruce Patello, who was governor of Bank of Scotland, and in my view the most successful banker of the 20th century, when Bruce Patello retired as chief executive of Bank of Scotland, he was paid 16 times the average salary in the bank. There wasn't a bonus, and he considered himself very well paid. The first year of HBOS, the merger between Bank of Scotland and Halifax, the chief executive was paid 46 times the average salary in the bank. And I think commonly now, chief executives of banks are paid 200 times the average salary in the bank. And that does not, in my view, fairly reflect the additional work that has to be done. But it does reflect the enormous size of banks which we now have, and the disincentive to regard risk and to regard customer service as the things that you ought to be concentrating on.
It is worth saying that just about every society has someone who's exactly tasked with that job anyway, usually under the name of competition commissioner, if you're in the European Union. But we have organisations specifically in society supposed to stop organisations from becoming, in one phrase, overmighty. Now, as to how you do it is a different question, but we already have someone out there who's supposed to be doing it when any corporation in any business gets too powerful. So perhaps we could just force the bankers to pay out more in dividends rather than grow the bank too large, which would be at least a pro-market approach. But this is something we're struggling with, I think, way, way beyond banking, which is, do we have overmighty citizens? And there's a huge new book on that called Unelected Power by Paul Tucker at the Bank of England, trying to answer some of the questions as to how we might limit the size of corporations in a free society. A good place to, I think we have to end there actually, because we have a hard stop, but the good news is we have some maybe free wine. I'm going to ask Erin to come up and just say a few words and explain what happens next. I should mention, of course, that Ray's book is for sale downstairs. Makes a fantastic Christmas present. And I think rather than embarrass him, I'll just stop there.
Can we just have a round of applause for Ray and Russell, please? And thank everybody for coming out tonight. It's great to see so many new faces tonight, so please do come again. EICC Live will be back in the new year with a whole plethora of different subjects, ranging from data to insect protein. So keep your eyes open for that. Our next topic on the 17th of February is going to be on cybersecurity, so in collaboration with Future Scot. So please do check out our website, have a look at our socials for more details on that. Also, all of our talks are available on YouTube. So if you just search EICC venue, then you should be able to find all of that. So thank you all again, and you are welcome to come and join us downstairs, where we will be doing a little bit of networking and wine. And Ray will also be signing his book, The Rise and Fall of the City of Money, The Financial History of Edinburgh. Make the perfect, if not a wee bit hefty, stocking filler. So thanks again, and see you all in the new year.